Welcome back, everybody, to an actual video. We truly live in an age of miracles, don't we? So yeah, today I want to talk about adaptations, especially movie and TV adaptations of fantasy books, and why there's a problem. And before we get into this one's from my newest Patreon backer, Reflector. Thanks, dude, and cheers. If you want a personal cheers, then you're more than welcome to join the Patreon, but there's no obligation to do so. I would just very much appreciate it because I'm poor. Anyway, that's that. Let's get into what I want to talk about today, and that is adaptations. So recently I logged onto YouTube and I scrolled through my recommendations, and what I saw was, oh, next Wheel of Time adaptations season. Here's like first reveals. Next one, why the Wheel of Time adaptation sucks. Next one, will the new Game of Thrones series will be good. Here's like, and it went on like that and on and on and on. So we had like the entire recommendations that was just people talking about book adaptations on TV or the movies, and or cinema, mostly TV though. And I was like, why? And then I'm like, I got an answer. But also, this sucks. And then I stumbled about and listened to, watched Dr. Philip Chase's Dear Dr. Fantasy with the wonderful Iskar Jarak, and they spend like an awful lot of time talking about a Malazan adaptation, and I'm like, why are we as people who read books specifically so fascinated with adaptations? Why do we get so many adaptations, and what's the issue? So that's what I want to talk about today, and why I think we might actually doing ourselves a disservice here. And I want to structure this roughly, we'll see, with like giving a short introduction to like the history of adaptations. Then I want to look at like why, from a lot of reasons, adaptations make a lot of sense, economically mostly, because of course we're going to blame capitalism. And then I want to look at like why that's actually not so good, and then I'll wrap it up, hopefully. So let's start this with a history of adaptation as made up by me right now. Well, we've always done adaptations. We've always adapted and played around in stories. You can go back all the fucking way into ancient history and you'll find, wherever there's mythology, you find depictions of stories, of elements of narratives. You find your black figure, red figure ceramics with wonderful pictures from the Trojan War, from the Argonauts, from all that stuff. You find it all the way. You go through like every period. We have always taken elements of stories and transformed them and translated them into different media. We take our epic poems and mythology, and then we have our big three, the big three tragedy writers in classical Athens, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and they turn those into, well, tragedies. And then we probably find people that add music to it, but we don't know about it because we have no way of recording music at the time, so or writing it down really. So that's sort of where we are, and then we discover a new medium, or a new medium becomes fancy, and we take the stories that we have already and we translate them into that new medium. And that's something we have always done. Whether it is depictions, or statues, or, well, theater, or the opera, when music, you know, is a thing, or, once it became available, cinema, or film in general. And there's reasons for that. And I want to look at that for a second, and that is, once we discover a new art form, and I think movie is sort of the one that we need to focus on here, because it is something that comes up distinctly at a point where we actually discover the technology. It's a new art form that goes hand in hand with technology. Radio is the same thing, right? We have radio plays and stuff like that, where we take stories that have already been written, have been out there, and we translate them into a new medium. And suddenly everyone is mass panicking because of War of the Worlds, or, you know, that kind of thing. Point is, Once we discover a new technology as a species, we play with that new technology. And how do we play? By taking something that we already know, translating it into that new medium, and then playing around with all the dials and seeing what we can do and do different and so forth. And that makes a lot of sense from all kinds of psychological and anthropological standpoints. That's how we figure out stuff in general, because we are that kind of species. So obviously, once movies come around, what we see a lot is, basically film recordings of theater plays. And then we add some of the new things that the new medium of film can offer. We suddenly have, subtitles, we have music added, we have special effects added, we have like huge changes of scenery, because suddenly we're no longer, limited to one theater stage. We can actually film on different locations, and suddenly a desert looks like a desert, or a jungle looks like a jungle, because we actually film in front of a bunch of plastic trees. You know what I mean? And that makes a lot of sense. And that has always been the case. So over human history, we can look at the fact that we have always taken stories that were already known, possibly popular, and translated them into different media. And that's fine. During that process of adaptation, we have ideally made use of the specific facets, the specific capabilities of a different medium to add a new interpretation, a new nuance, a new perspective to an already known story, already known narrative. Changing from a epic poem to a theater, to a tragedy, with several actors acting out things and so forth, changes the perspective in a lot of ways, because we get an interpretation, I guess, and so forth. Doing the same with a tragedy that is a play on stage, adding actual outside shots, adding camera lenses, adding different camera perspectives, zooming in, all those things that the movie or the film medium can add. Can change perspective, can change interpretation when we focus on one character and so forth. There is always an added level. And then we come to what is really important with new art forms, which is sort of something we'll get back to later on in this ramble. And that is, we then create stories or pieces of art that are specific to a new medium. We write films that are, and produce films that are taking advantage to the fullest of the capabilities of the medium of film, and are written in a way and are told in a way that is particular to that specific medium. And they can probably do things that are very, very difficult to reproduce in any other form of medium. And that's sort of the ideal, to make art form specific content, so to speak. And we've done that with every story out there, with every medium out there, and that's also fine, and that's actually really commendable. So now let's look at why adaptations make a lot of sense for a lot of people in a lot of ways. And there's positive aspects. Let's start with the first one. Adaptations, especially, and we're going to focus on the film later on. But basically, what we do with an adaptation is we take something that is already familiar, translate it into a new medium, gives us a chance to explore that new medium. Also, we already have an audience out there that knows the story, can, while consuming that new medium, also learn all about the new medium, because they don't have to focus on a story they don't know yet. And that's pretty cool to introduce a new medium. And there's more. There's an economic reason when we come now to the film thing. Filming stuff is cheaper than live performances, and that is good for both sides. Look, I'll focus on musicals for a second here, because I think it's a good example. If you produce a musical as in a theater, that's a very, very expensive thing. Don't get me wrong, opera is just as expensive, but I think musical works better because we have had a ton of musical films over the last couple of decades, and all of that stuff. So let's stick with that. You put on like a theatre show, in this case a musical, you have to pay artists, you have to pay an orchestra, you have to pay stage people, all of these people, and this is the vital part, you have to do that every single fucking day. So the costs are relatively high for producing that kind of thing continuously. On the other hand, attending a musical, a live performance of a musical, is fucking expensive for the person, right? You have to travel to the place where it is performed. You have to, if you're not living in that town, that city, you have to pay for travel, you have to pay for accommodation, you have to pay for an expensive fucking ticket. Like, you try and watch a musical, you're out a couple $100 just by default, and not many people can afford that. That limits access to a story, to a piece of art, to a medium. And filming the whole thing, or turning it into an actual, movie, like musical movie, changes that. Yes, you still have to pay actors and all of that stuff, but you pay them once. And then you can make copies and replicas and send them all over the fucking country on the other, and continue to rake in those dollars, right? But at the same time, if I want to see that musical, I now have to go to my local theater, my movie theater, and I still pay way too much money and eat cheap popcorn and all of that stuff, but it's already much cheaper than flying to New York and going to the Broadway, right? Just by default. And if I can't afford that, I can nowadays stream the whole thing at home on my computer for, I don't know, whatever Netflix charges these days. And that's even more accessible. And accessibility in times of economic pressure is a huge advantage in a lot of ways. Now, we can obviously go and talk about whether adaptations are the same as the other one, and if you're not still missing out, and there's obviously discussions to be had on that, but I feel that having access to a specific story in whatever form it is in, to as large a group of people as possible, is a good thing. Accessibility is always a good thing. Just saying. And, that's a positive. And I'm all for it. All right. So now, let's look at the specific thing that I wanted to look at, and that is film adaptations of genre fiction and why they are so ubiquitous, and where the problem lies with that. And for that, we get to blame George Lucas, which is always fun. He deserves the blame, don't get me wrong. Okay, so I think Star Wars is somewhat the turning point for the trend that we see today in these extreme ways. And what Star Wars does is something that, while you can go back into ancient history and still already see the roots for that, it is something that has a huge impact on contemporary content industry, so to speak. What do I mean? Now, once again, all the way back to whenever we started painting pictures of heroes, of Homeric heroes and whatnot, we have always kind of added expanded story worlds. The idea of a story world or a narrative with adjacent world or its surrounding world, outliers that could be depictions, statues, paintings, additional episodes, slotted in or taken out and whatnot. That's something that we've always done. But what Star Wars did was make the whole thing economic in a very specific way. You famously know that, Star Wars is basically George Lucas shoehorning a half-understood Joseph Campbell hero's journey into the stage set for Dune and making shitloads of money out of it. And that's fine. But what he really did is, keep the rights for merchandise and all that stuff, and turning it into a machine, into a money-making machine. And there's two things happening at that point. One is that, I guess, movie studios or like content companies in general, copyright holding companies, content holding companies, realized the idea of an intellectual property that goes beyond just one film or just one story, that encompasses that whole universe, that whole story universe, that whole thing. And realizing that it is financially viable, because suddenly you have Star Wars everything. Star Wars lunchboxes, Star Wars Christmas specials, Star Wars all kinds of crazy stuff going on, and George Lucas is getting fucking rich of it. So obviously, companies that are trying to maximize their, winnings, their profits, will try to look at that and it's like, how can we do that as well? And that's just natural because that's how capitalism works. And that's fine. Now, there's an additional thing happening at the same time when you look at what Star Wars does really early on is, having books in that expanded universe. One of the few cases where the adaptation kind of goes the other way. I mean, yes, we have all these tie-in novels nowadays, but I think Star Wars is the only one where it really exploded in huge ways. We have gaming stuff. We have tabletop role-playing source books and stuff like that. We have computer games fairly early on. All of that stuff. And that points to another thing that is important. That's something that is specific about that time frame, which is Star Wars coming out at the end of the 70s, and the end of the 70s and beginning of the of the 80s is sort of the rise of what you might call nerd culture in a specific way. That is, computer games are starting to become a thing. Tabletop role-playing is becoming an actual industry. And that means that the whole idea of fantasy and science fiction, and to a lesser point horror, that whole geek sphere that older people remember, and that has turned into what it is nowadays, that kind of starts to become an actual industry at that point. Role-playing game designers start actually building companies that are sort of financially viable, even though most of them are really bad business people. But, TSR, Chaosium, those companies build up at the time. And larger companies from outside that market realize that fantasy and science fiction can be a huge market in every form of media. And that's I think, the other component that goes hand in hand with the success of Star Wars as an intellectual property that goes way beyond just a story or just a trilogy of movies that goes into all these other things. We have that on the large scale, on the movie scale. And at the same time, we have that rise in popularity, or a return in popularity, in a way, of all kinds of other fantasy and science fiction stories, fantasy and science fiction worlds, all of that happening at the same time. And that brings us sort of to the 90s and then 2000s. I mean, you already see that happening in the 80s with a bunch of fairly original fantasy movies out there that... some of them even made by George Lucas. But, you see that stuff happening at that time, and that's great. And then we come to where we kind of end up now. Although we need to look at the internet at some point as well, but I'll splice that in later. So what happens is, I think, that other companies want a slice of that cake. They want to have their own fantasy or science fiction franchise they can make a shitload of money out of in every possible medium. Book, computer game, TV show, movie, musical, what have you. So they're, on the one hand, casting around for which ones they can take, which ones might actually work. And that's, all fair and good. And that is where we come to the book-to-movie pipeline. Because, as a company, you want to do economically sensible things under capitalism. That is, minimal investment with minimal risk and maximum rewards. And when we look at how these things work, and you need like a story that you can then turn into all kinds of different media, books are ideal because books are cheap. Because to write a book, you need one person and a typewriter, basically. I mean, of course you need editors, you need the whole publishing world behind it. Don't get me wrong. I understand that, but at its core, you need one person that writes that damn book, one person that edits the damn book, and one person who prints that damn book. That's cheap. If your first iteration of that story is a movie, you need a director, you need a ton of actors, you need cameramen, camera people, you need soundtrack people, you need editors, you need... Movies are fucking expensive to produce, is my point here. And if we're talking about a new story, a new world, a new fantasy universe, a new story world, so to speak, going with the book is the easiest way. The investment is low. If it's already out there, even better. We see it has already started gaining some traction. The publisher has probably invested very little in like an up-and-coming writer or new franchise, a new series, a new story world, and they're already making a lot of money. The book is out there, people know it. People have heard of Harry Potter. It is fairly simple for Warner or whoever actually owns that shit to then give J.K. Rowling a shit ton of money and make Harry Potter movies, and they're safe investments. You know they will sell because the name's already out there. But the book side was comparatively risk-free compared to the other way around. Take, for example, Avatar, that James Cameron thing, which was a colossal failure in a lot of ways because it's a more or less unique story, a more or less unique universe, and a lot of things, but it's absolutely fucking expensive to do that, and to then actually translate it into other, it also sucked, but that's a different point. But usually, if you're not James Cameron with all the clout that James Cameron already has, you're not going to get that greenlit by any movie studio, by any media company, corporation. You're not going to get that greenlit because they don't want to risk that money. But taking an already existing book is a safe bet, a fairly safe investment, which is why we get, on the teenage side of things, which is sort of where this kind of started out. You get Harry Potter, and then you get Twilight, and then you get The Hunger Games, and a lot of less successful versions of the same kind of thing. But, those were safe investments, especially with, kids, basically, where you also capture you have one fan that's a kid, and then you have all the parents having to go with them to the movies and all that crap, so you get, more customers at once, but, different story. Point is, we see that happening a lot. Books are fairly cheap, and they already bring their audience with them, and this is where we need to talk about the internet. Now, the internet starts out to be a thing in the 90s and grows explosively in the early 2000s with the advent of what you might call social media, or more accessible social media, because we're no longer hanging out in Usenet groups or on various, text forums somewhere in the internet. No, we're all using Tumblr or at some point MySpace, I guess, and then Facebook, and we're using social media that is accessible to everyone. And what it does is it connects people, and that's great, right? I'm a fan of a huge number of books, and I do have friends that read books, but not all of them read the same books. If I want to talk Black Company, which I'm doing right now with, all you wonderful folks that are in part of the read-along, I don't have anyone in my physical world out here friend group that has read those books. I cannot talk with them about it. Now, I can badger them until they start reading it, which may or may not work, but that's hard. I log on to the internet, I suddenly have at least 50 people that have read The Black Company, and I can talk with them, and suddenly these communities gain traction, and that has two sides. One side is I, as the fan, feel validated and can, motivated to create fan art, do all these wonderful things, conversations forever and ever and ever, and that's great. And it's visible to market researchers. So the internet, in a way that goes beyond mere sales figures, gives companies a way to gauge interest in a specific piece of media that they may want to buy or license to produce a different medium. They can see if there's engagement out there already of people that are, big enough fans of the story that they will probably also pay for the movie ticket and all the other crap that comes after that. And that makes it very, very tempting. And that's sort of where we are nowadays, right? We had the, TV show format being, having the big breakout with Game of Thrones, and lesser things like Legend of the Seeker or the Shannara show and all this other stuff. But it was shown that taking a book, turning it into a TV show or a movie can be hugely successful. So everyone does the same thing. People go and buy, license Altered Carbon, license The Man in the High Castle, though I guess that one was really cheap. Get Good Omens, finally, get American Gods, finally go and actually do Wheel of Time, because they figure they can replicate that model, and it's still a fairly easy way to do it. You already have a fandom out there that is waiting for it, and we need to talk about that for a second, and you already know that buying the rights to the book is fairly cheap. It's still cheaper than actually developing something from scratch, because you have some sort of way to gauge its success already, and that's where we are right now, and suddenly we have shit tons of that stuff. Now, there's two things that we need to talk about before we can wrap this up. Number one, why we, as watchers or readers, love those adaptations, and why that is maybe not all that good. So here's the thing. A lot of times entertainment is, and I think it's sort of even more so the case with TV shows and movies than it is with books. In a lot of cases, that is pure escapism, right? We go and do that to be distracted from the pressures that we are under in this hellscape that is late-stage capitalism. So we want to have like big explosions and stuff that is nice to watch, but we don't need to think too much about. And that's fair enough. Don't get me wrong, that's fair enough. And part of that is that if we already know the story and just see it in like different colors or a different perspective, that's easy because we already know where it's going. Watching Game of Thrones, if you have read the Song of Ice and Fire books before, is easy because you kind of know where it's going. You already know who's going to die when. Watching Wheel of Time, sort of the same thing. You kind of know where the plot is going. There's obviously a lot of stuff going on with that TV show that I will not talk about because I haven't watched it, but the basic idea is the same. Plus, the differences between the book and the adaptation give you all kinds of places to discuss and talk and create more buzz on social media that will possibly draw in more people to actually go and watch that movie, that TV show, and see if it's really that bad and so forth. You just, by the fact that both differ, and people will either like or not like those differences, and we'll talk about it online, you already create or give them an easy way to build up more buzz for your new project of media. So our need to have fairly accessible and not too taxing entertainment on the screen makes us click into that and look at that. Our already built up engagement with the fandom in the start makes us take part in those discussions online, those arguments on whether it's good or bad, and all of that creates more attention for that new piece of media. So that's very, very tempting for the companies that own those, that make those stories. And yeah, all of that's fine. And now we come to the bad part. The bad part is, of course, that we're talking about adaptations. And we talk about companies. They make those adaptations. They cost money. And if I am a movie studio, I have a finite amount of money, I have a finite budget, and I want to invest that with, once again, as little risk as possible, with the highest possible gains. So I spend that money for those adaptations. I don't have any money left to actually create original materials. Now, why would I want to do that as a company? I'm not, why not? My goal is to make as much money as possible. But, and this is the problem, we're missing out. Because remember what I said earlier? Ideally, we create stories, new stories, pieces of media that take full advantage, that are tailored particularly, especially to a specific form of media, that take full advantage of the possibilities of that specific medium. We make something exclusive to that piece, to that form of media, to actually get the maximum out of it on an artistic level. And we're not getting that because there's no money left for it, and there's no economic incentive to do that. So what we're stuck with is more or less shitty adaptations, or sometimes really successful adaptations, of books that we've already read, and we're not getting any new stories. We're just getting the old stories again and again, repackaged. And it's very easy to complain about that, but I think it's important to understand where all of that is coming from, and that it is a problem, especially with those adaptations. I have no interest in seeing Wheel of Time. I've read it. I know it's shit. I have no interest in watching Game of Thrones. I've never watched it. I read the books. They're okay, I guess. I don't even want a Malazan adaptation because I read the books. They're there. I have it. I don't need that perspective. I'd rather have something unique. Something unique in a movie. And when was the last time you've seen a movie or a TV show that was just made for that specific medium? And no, Star Trek doesn't count because that's been around forever. But when was the last time outside of Star Trek and Star Wars that you have seen an original science fiction series? Well, 90s Stargate, I guess, and Babylon 5. But in fantasy. When was the last time you've seen an actual fantasy series with the level of, you know, production values and whatnot that Game of Thrones or Wheel of Time have? I don't know. I can't remember. Possibly never. And the reason is that whole mess that I've just laid out. And I think that's a shame, because I'd rather have something original there. So yeah, I just wanted to go through all of that and talk about like why this is a problem on an artistic level, why it is understandable for all kinds of reasons, and why I still think it's sad. I hope you're still with me. If so, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, share. My goal is to reach 800 subscribers by my birthday, which is next week, and it's possible, but I need your help for that. So go out and help me. It would really make me happy, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.